Bangladesh, a nation with a history of political tumult, found itself once again on the brink. At the heart of the unrest was Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who had dominated the nation's political landscape for over a decade. Her tenure had become increasingly characterized by allegations of authoritarianism and suppression of dissent. These tensions erupted into widespread protests, fueled by a controversial quota system seen as favoring certain segments of society. The quota system aimed to provide preferential treatment to the descendants of freedom fighters in areas like government jobs and education. While intended to honor the legacy of Bangladesh's liberation struggle, the policy ignited accusations of deepening inequality. As demonstrations gained momentum, the government's response was swift and severe. Security forces were deployed to quell the unrest, leading to clashes that resulted in casualties and condemnation from human rights groups. Amidst the escalating chaos, all eyes turned to the Bangladesh Army, a powerful institution with a history of intervening in the nation's political affairs. The military silence in the face of growing unrest was deafening, interpreted by some as tacit support for the protesters while others feared a potential coup. The Bangladesh Army, deeply embedded in the nation's history, initially adopted a posture of cautious neutrality. Bound by its constitutional role and mindful of international scrutiny, the military refrained from direct engagement in the protests. Yet, as the crisis deepened, the military's stance began to shift subtly. Army Chief General Wakar-uz-Zaman issued a carefully worded statement that sent ripples through the nation. Expressing concern over the escalating violence, the general urged restraint from both sides, emphasizing the Army's commitment to upholding the Constitution. This message, while seemingly neutral, hinted at the military's growing unease. The general's statement was widely interpreted as a warning shot to the government. The emphasis on the military's constitutional duty to protect the people signaled that the army was no longer content to remain on the sidelines. The delicate balance between upholding the existing order and preventing the nation's descent into chaos had begun to tip. The international community, already alarmed by the unfolding crisis, urged all parties to exercise restraint and seek a peaceful resolution. The eyes of the world turned towards Bangladesh as the crisis deepened, drawing condemnation from international organizations and Western governments. The violent crackdown on protesters sparked calls for an end to the violence and respect for human rights. The United Nations expressed deep concern, urging all parties to engage in dialogue and seek a peaceful resolution. Within Bangladesh, the crisis reverberated through all facets of society. The business community grew increasingly anxious about the impact of the unrest on the nation's fragile stability. The prolonged protests and the government's heavy-handed response had disrupted daily life and scared away investors. As pressure mounted from both domestic and international actors, the Bangladesh Army found itself caught in a delicate balancing act. In a dramatic turn of events, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina announced her resignation, ending her 15-year grip on power. Her decision came after weeks of escalating protests and mounting pressure from both domestic and international actors. The military played a key role in facilitating Hasina's departure from the capital, Dhaka. With Hasina's departure, a palpable sense of uncertainty gripped the nation. Into this vacuum stepped Army Chief General Wakar-uz-Zaman, who had become increasingly prominent in the preceding weeks. Addressing a nation on edge, the general announced the military's assumption of control, declaring a state of emergency and imposing a curfew. He assured the public that the army's intervention was temporary, aimed solely at restoring order and stability. The general pledged to form an interim government composed of technocrats and experienced administrators, tasked with guiding the nation through the crisis. Crucially, he promised to hold elections in due course, offering a glimmer of hope for a return to democratic rule. The military takeover elicited a mixed response both within Bangladesh and on the international stage. The immediate aftermath of the military takeover was marked by a palpable sense of uncertainty. The army, now the de facto power in Bangladesh, moved swiftly to consolidate its control. Troops were deployed to strategic locations across major cities, and restrictions were placed on public gatherings. The media faced new constraints, with the military keeping a close eye on reporting. The interim government, hastily assembled, focused on restoring order, addressing grievances, and preventing the nation's fragile economy from collapsing. The international community, divided in its response to the coup, continued to monitor the situation closely. Western nations urged the military junta to provide a clear timetable for a return to civilian rule. As Bangladesh navigated the uncharted waters of a military takeover, the nation found itself at a crossroads. The world watched with a mixture of hope and apprehension, uncertain whether the coup would prove to be a temporary deviation or a more permanent setback for democracy. The aspirations of the Bangladeshi people, who had tasted freedom and yearned for a more just society, hung in the balance. The international community continued to urge the military junta to make good on its promise of a return to civilian rule. The United Nations called for a dialogue between the military and political parties, aiming to chart a path towards free and fair elections. Neighboring countries, particularly India, observed the developments with a mixture of concern and pragmatism. The specter of a humanitarian crisis loomed large, adding urgency to the calls for a swift resolution. The coming months would prove to be a litmus test for Bangladesh's future.